My father didn't lower his voice. He didn't hesitate. He lifted the old yellowed passbook high enough for the entire room to see, smiled into the microphone and said, "Trash belongs with trash." Then he dropped it, straight into the bucket of ice and champagne at my feet. The sound was soft, a wet slap. But the laughter that followed was loud enough to crack something open inside me. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't say a word. I stepped out of my wedding reception in silence, carrying something far heavier than humiliation. And 3 days later, a bank teller looked at that same ruined book and whispered, "Ma'am, please don't leave." The ballroom smelled like roses and melted butter, white linens, crystal glasses, everything polished to reflect the kind of life my father believed our family represented. Generational respectability, control, appearances. It was my wedding day, but it felt like a performance staged for him. I stood near the head table in my dress, ivory satin long sleeves, conservative by design. My grandmother had helped me choose it. "You don't need sparkle," she'd said, her hands trembling as she smoothed the fabric. "You already survived harder things." She sat 2 rows back, now small, and folded into herself a pale blue cardigan draped over her shoulders like armor that no longer fit. Her eyes met mine once briefly. She gave me the smallest nod. When it was time for the speeches, my father rose first. Of course he did. He always spoke first. He adjusted the microphone, waited for the room to quiet, and smiled the way men do when they believe silence belongs to them. He talked about legacy, about family values, about discipline. He mentioned my service in the U.S. Army only once, and even then it sounded like a footnote. "She always needed structure," he said, chuckling. The room laughed politely. Then my grandmother stood. There was a soft murmur as people realized she was moving forward. She wasn't on the program. She never was. My father frowned slightly, but he didn't stop her. He liked to appear magnanimous. She reached me slowly, her steps careful, her hand gripping a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. Up close, I could see the veins beneath her thin skin, the faint bruise on her wrist from where she'd bumped the counter that morning. "For you," she whispered, pressing it into my palm. Her voice shook, but her eyes didn't. "Your grandfather wanted you to have it." I unfolded the cloth. Inside was an old passbook. The cover was cracked, the edges soft with age. The paper smelled faintly of dust and time. It wasn't pretty. It didn't match the room. It didn't belong in a place where money wore tuxedos. I felt my father step closer before I heard him. "What's that?" he asked into the microphone, his tone light, curious. "Dangerous." I didn't answer fast enough. He reached out and took it from my hands. The room leaned in. He flipped it open once, twice. His mouth twisted, not in confusion but disgust. "This," he said, holding it up. "This is what we're doing now." A few uncomfortable laughs scattered across the tables. "An old savings book," he continued. "From the 1970s, he shook his head, smiling like a man indulging a child's fantasy. "We've moved on from this kind of thing." He looked down at the champagne bucket beside the podium. Ice cubes floated in pale gold liquid condensation pooling on the floor beneath it. "Trash belongs with trash," he said clearly. And then he let go. The book fell into the ice. There was a collective gasp followed by laughter. Not cruel, not kind. The kind people use to stay safe. I stared at the bucket. The passbook floated for a second before sinking pages blooming open like a wound. I didn't think. I knelt. Cold bit into my fingers as I plunged my hand into the ice water, soaking through the lace at my cuffs, up my sleeve into the lining of my dress. Someone murmured my name. Someone else laughed again, sharper this time. I pulled the book out, dripping and ruined, pressed it to my chest, and stood. My father leaned toward the mic. "Don't be dramatic," he said softly. "Sit down." I didn't look at him. I didn't look at anyone. I turned and walked out. Outside, the evening air was cool and smelled like cut grass and distant ocean. I stood under the portico, my dress heavy with water, my hands numb. The sounds of the reception leaked through the doors, music restarting, voices rising, the world correcting itself now that I was gone. My grandmother came out minutes later. She didn't touch me, she just stood beside me. "I'm sorry," she said. I shook my head. "Don't be." She looked at the wet book in my hands. "He never opened it," she said quietly. Neither did I. That night, I went home without changing. I laid the passbook on the kitchen counter and watched the pages dry into stiff, wrinkled shapes. I didn't cry. The Army teaches you how to hold still when everything inside wants to fracture. 3 days later, I walked into the First National Bank downtown. The lobby was marble and hush. Polished shoes whispered across the floor. I wore jeans boots, a plain coat I'd bought secondhand years ago. I carried the passbook in a clear plastic bag sealed tight like evidence. The teller was young, early 20s. She took the bag with 2 fingers, her expression carefully neutral. "I'd like to check the balance," I said. It was a gift. She nodded, already typing, her eyes flicking once to the warped pages. I could see what she expected. An error. A 0. Something easy. Then she stopped. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She blinked, leaned closer to the screen. The color drained from her face. "Ma'am," she whispered, standing abruptly, "please don't leave, just a moment." She disappeared through a side door. People began to look at me. I stood there holding the counter, feeling the same calm I'd felt on patrol overseas when the radio went quiet, and you knew something was wrong. I had walked out of my wedding carrying trash. I was about to learn what it was really worth. The waiting area smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. Somewhere overhead, an air vent hummed steadily, a sound so controlled it felt deliberate. I stood at the counter where the young teller had left me, my hands resting flat on the cool stone, the plastic bag with the passbook between them. People pretended not to stare. A man in a gray suit shifted his briefcase from one hand to the other. A woman near the door glanced at her phone, then at me, then back to her phone. The quiet wasn't hostile. It was curious. The kind of attention that settles on you when something has gone slightly unmistakably wrong. I didn't move. In the Army, you learn early that panic wastes oxygen. You learn how to breathe when your body wants to run, how to hold your posture when every nerve is lit up. Standing there in that bank lobby, I felt the same tightening in my chest I'd felt before missions when the plan fractured and you had to wait for new orders. The side door opened again. The teller returned, but she wasn't alone. Behind her walked a man in his 50s, silver hair, neatly combed glasses perched low on his nose. He wore the calm authority of someone used to delivering decisions, not asking permission. Another man followed, taller, younger, dressed sharply in a tailored suit that looked too expensive for a branch office. They didn't look at the passbook first. They looked at me. "Miss," the older man said, his voice low and controlled. "Would you mind stepping with us into a private room?" I nodded. He gestured down a short hallway. The teller trailed behind us, her hands clasped so tightly I could see the tendons standing out in her wrists. The room they led me into was small but elegant. A heavy wooden table, 2 leather chairs, framed certificates lining the walls. It smelled like dust and ink and something metallic, the way old buildings always do when they've been holding secrets for decades. "Please," the man said, pulling out a chair, "have a seat." I sat. He placed the plastic bag gently on the table as if it were fragile. "I'm Daniel Whitaker," he said. "Branch manager. This is Thomas Reed, our regional director." The younger man inclined his head. His eyes never left the bag. "Before we proceed," Whitaker continued, "I want to ask you a simple question." He paused, giving the words weight. "Do you know what this account is?" I considered lying. It would have been easy, but something in his tone told me it wouldn't help. "No," I said. "I was told it was a savings account. My grandmother gave it to me." He nodded slowly. "And your grandmother's name?" "Margaret Hale." That did it. Reed exhaled sharply through his nose. Whitaker closed his eyes for a brief second, the way people do when a long-held possibility finally becomes real. "We've been waiting for this account to surface," Reed said quietly, "for a very long time." I felt the air shift in the room like pressure changing before a storm. Whitaker opened the bag and removed the passbook, setting it on a clean blotter. He didn't flinch at the warped pages. He handled it with reverence. "This isn't a standard savings account," he said. "In 1979, your grandfather established a trust-linked account here under a Totten arrangement. It was unusual even then." I stared at the book, the same book my father had tossed aside without a second glance. "He was an early investor," Reed added, Very early, he reinvested every dividend, never touched the principal. Whitaker slid a folder across the table toward me. We've maintained the account under internal watch due to inactivity and its structure, but without a claimant, we couldn't release information. He opened the folder. Inside was a single page. Numbers filled it. I read them once, then again. The total sat there unadorned. No commas to soften it. No explanation to ease it into my understanding. I didn't gasp. I didn't speak. My hands went numb. Reed watched me carefully. "Are you all right?" "Yes," I said. And it was true. Shock for me didn't look like chaos, it looked like stillness. "That amount," Whitaker said, "is fully vested, legally payable to you upon your grandfather's passing, which, according to our records," he hesitated, "occurred 12 years ago." My throat tightened. No one contacted us. Reed shook his head. The trust was sealed. Your grandfather anticipated interference. I knew exactly what kind. "Is there anyone else listed?" I asked. "No," Whitaker said. "Only you." The room felt suddenly too small. My father's voice echoed in my head. "Trash belongs with trash." He had held millions in his hands and dismissed it because it didn't look impressive enough, because it came from someone he had already decided was irrelevant. I looked at the passbook again. The wrinkled pages, the faded ink, the quiet patience of it. "This changes things," Reed said carefully. "We'll need to move forward with verification, of course. But," he smiled faintly, "congratulations, Miss Hale. Your grandfather was very deliberate." I nodded once. As they stepped out to retrieve additional documents, I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. And just like that, I wasn't in a bank anymore. I was 10 years old, standing barefoot on a kitchen tile floor holding a broken plate while my father watched from the doorway. He hadn't yelled then either. He never needed to. Silence was his weapon. Disappointment sharpened into control. "Clean it up," he'd said, "and be more careful next time." I had learned early that survival meant obedience, that being small kept you safe. The door clicked open, pulling me back to the present. Whitaker returned with a thicker file this time. "We'll proceed at your pace," he said. "There's no rush." I met his eyes. There will be. I left the bank an hour later with copies of documents sealed in an envelope. Outside, the city moved on as if nothing had changed. Cars passed, people laughed, a dog barked somewhere down the street. I sat in my car for a long moment, the envelope on the passenger seat, the weight of it pressing into my awareness. I didn't call my husband. I didn't call my grandmother. I didn't call my father. I started the engine and drove home. Because I knew one thing with absolute certainty now. If my father found out what that book really was, he wouldn't laugh. He would come hunting. The drive home blurred into muscle memory. Turns I'd taken 100 times before. Red lights. Green lights. The quiet discipline of staying between the lines. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as it always had, small, clean, unremarkable. The kind of place that never hinted at the storms it had taught me to endure. Inside, I placed the envelope on the kitchen table and didn't open it again. I didn't need to. I could still see the numbers when I closed my eyes. They hovered there, unreal and heavy like coordinates to a destination I hadn't decided to reach yet. I made coffee, not because I needed it, but because routine steadied me. The kettle whistled, and with it came a memory so sharp it almost made me flinch. I was 12, standing in my father's study, the smell of leather and aftershave thick in the air. He sat behind his desk, fingers steepled, watching me like I was a problem he hadn't yet solved. My grandmother stood near the door, hands folded, eyes downcast. "You embarrassed me," he said calmly. I didn't know how. I still didn't. "I asked you a question at dinner," he continued. "You hesitated. That tells people you don't know your place." I nodded. I always nodded. "Go to your room," he said. "Think about how you represent this family." That was how he punished me, not with bruises, but with absence, with the withdrawal of approval I'd been trained to crave. The kettle clicked off. I poured the water and watched the steam rise, then fade. Growing up, my father was a man who believed in order above all else. Order in his house, order in his business, order in his children. He had built his life brick by brick, and he expected us to fit neatly into the structure he designed. My brother did. He mirrored my father's confidence, his appetite for attention. He learned early that being loud earned protection. I learned something else. I learned that silence made me invisible. When I enlisted, my father didn't object. He framed it as pride told people I was finding discipline. But I knew the truth. The military appealed to him because it promised control over me without requiring his presence. Someone else would give the orders. Someone else would shape me. What he didn't understand was that the army didn't teach me obedience. It taught me discernment. It taught me the difference between noise and threat, between authority and arrogance, between reacting and choosing. Those lessons came back to me now as I sat alone at the table, the envelope untouched. My phone buzzed. His name lit up the screen. I let it ring. It buzzed again a few minutes later, then again. On the fourth call, I answered. "What is it?" I said. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "You left," he said, "without saying goodbye." I did. "You humiliated me," he snapped, "in front of my guests." I pictured him in the ballroom straightening his jacket, smoothing the moment over the way he always did, turning discomfort into a story where he was still in control. "You humiliated yourself," I said quietly. There was a pause, a recalibration. "That old woman had no business doing that," he said, dragging out some relic, making a scene. "She gave me a gift," I replied. He laughed short and dismissive. "If that's what you want to call it." I looked at the envelope on the table, at the careful edges, the patience of paper that had waited decades. "Did you ever ask what was in it?" I asked. Another pause, this one longer. "It was garbage," he said. I could tell by the look of it. "Because it didn't look expensive," I said. He scoffed. "Because I know value." I closed my eyes. "That's all I said. Goodbye." I hung up before he could respond. That night I went to see my grandmother. Her house was small and warm, filled with the smell of lavender and old books. She sat in her armchair, hands folded in her lap, eyes lighting up when she saw me. "You came?" she said softly. I knelt in front of her. "Why didn't you tell me?" She smiled sadly. "Your grandfather wanted it that way. He said power is safest when it waits." I swallowed. He knew. She nodded. "He saw how your father treated you. He wanted you protected." I took her hands in mine, feeling how fragile they were. "I won't let him touch it," I said. "I know," she replied. "You were always the strong one, even when you were quiet." Driving home, I felt something settle into place. Not anger, not fear. Clarity. The next morning, my father called again. His voice was different this time, measured, almost gentle. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the passbook." I waited. "If there's anything of value there," he continued, "it should be handled properly, by someone who understands these matters." I almost smiled. The hunter had caught a scent. And I knew then that the silence I'd learned to live inside was about to become something else entirely. The bank called the next morning. Not the branch, not the teller. The number came up as a private line, and when I answered, the voice on the other end was careful, practiced the kind that chose words the way surgeons choose instruments. "Miss Hale," the woman said, "this is Eleanor Price from First National's Trust Administration Office. We'd like to schedule a verification appointment." I glanced at the calendar pinned to my refrigerator. Deployment training, medical evaluations, a life built on orders and checklists. When I asked, "Today, if possible." I drove downtown again, the envelope riding shotgun like a quiet passenger. The trust office sat on the upper floors, far from the marble lobby and the public counters. The elevator hummed as it climbed each floor, clicking past like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. The conference room was larger this time. Sunlight poured through tall windows. The city spread below us, neat and indifferent. Ms. Price arrived with 2 associates and a file so thick it made a dull sound when it hit the table. "We'll move slowly," she said, "and you can stop us at any point." I nodded. She opened the file and began to explain. Dates, names, structures that had been designed long before I was born. My grandfather had been methodical, cautious. He had built the account the way engineers build bridges, anticipating stress planning for sabotage. He anticipated legal interference, Ms. Price said gently, which is why the trust remained dormant until a direct beneficiary appeared in person. I thought of my father's laugh, the ease with which he'd dismissed the book. The numbers came again. Not as a single shocking total this time, but broken into pieces. Investments, dividends, 40 years of quiet growth. This is not speculative wealth, she said. It's conservative, stable, intentionally boring. I almost laughed. Is there any chance my father, I stopped myself, anyone else could claim it? No, she said. The documentation is airtight. A strange feeling washed over me then. Not joy, not relief. Safety. The kind that settles in your bones when you realize the ground beneath you won't give way. When I left the building, my phone buzzed again. Him. I didn't answer. Instead, I drove to the armory. The familiar smell of oil and metal wrapped around me as I stepped inside. Soldiers moved through their routines, boots echoing against concrete. Rank meant clarity here. Orders had purpose. No one pretended to be something they weren't. I sat in my car afterward, staring at the steering wheel, letting the contrast sink in. My father had always believed power announced itself, that it demanded attention, that it needed to be seen to be real. He was wrong. That evening, he showed up at my door. I didn't hear the knock at first. I heard the impatience in it, sharp, demanding. When I opened the door, he stood there with his jacket unbuttoned, tie loosened, the faint smell of cologne and irritation clinging to him. We need to talk, he said, stepping forward as if the space already belonged to him. I didn't move. You can talk. His eyes flicked past me, taking in the house, the modest furniture, the absence of anything that suggested wealth. His mouth tightened. I spoke to a contact, he said, at the bank. I raised an eyebrow. You have contacts everywhere. Yes, he said sharply, and one of them mentioned an old account resurfacing. I waited. If there's money involved, he continued, this isn't something you should be handling alone. There it is, I said quietly. He frowned. There what is? The part where you decide I'm incapable. His jaw set. This isn't about you, it's about responsibility. It's about control, I corrected. He laughed, but it was thinner than before. You're being emotional. I stepped back and opened the door wider. Come in. He hesitated, surprised. Inside, he paced while I sat at the table. He talked about lawyers, about taxes, about how easily things could go wrong if mishandled. You don't understand the risks, he said. Federal oversight, audits, exposure. I understand risk, I replied. I live with it. He stopped pacing, looked at me fully for the first time. You don't have the experience, he said. I do. I folded my hands. Is that why you didn't read the passbook before you threw it away? The silence was immediate. What he asked. You never opened it, I said. You never asked what was inside. His eyes narrowed, because it was nothing. I met his gaze. It wasn't. The air shifted. How much, he asked finally. I didn't answer right away. I watched the calculation begin behind his eyes the way it always did when something threatened his sense of order. It's substantial, I said. He exhaled slowly, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Then we need to move quickly. We. I can bring in my attorney, he continued. We'll structure it under the family umbrella. Protect it. From what I asked. From scrutiny, he said. From mistakes. From me, he meant. I leaned back. Let me think about it. He studied me, clearly displeased. But he nodded. Don't wait too long. Opportunity doesn't like hesitation. When he left, I locked the door and rested my forehead against it. I wasn't angry. I was prepared. Because now I knew exactly how this would play out. He would come back with promises and threats wrapped in the same language he'd used my entire life, and he would assume, as he always had, that silence meant submission. He had no idea what kind of silence he was dealing with now. My father didn't wait long. He never did once he believed something belonged to him. 2 days after showing up at my door, he called again, this time with a softness in his voice that felt rehearsed. The edge was gone. The authority had been wrapped in concern like a blade hidden in velvet. I've been worried about you, he said. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the same place where he had once told me I embarrassed him for hesitating at dinner. The envelope from the bank lay in a drawer, now out of sight, but not out of mind. I'm fine, I said. I know this must feel overwhelming, he continued. Money has a way of doing that, especially when it comes out of nowhere. It didn't come out of nowhere, I replied. It waited. A pause. He didn't like that answer. I've spoken to a tax attorney, he said, pressing on. Someone very discreet. He agrees this situation needs careful handling. I pictured the attorney he'd chosen, one who knew how to blur lines, one who understood how to make things disappear. I didn't ask you to, I said. No, he agreed, but I'm your father. It's my responsibility. There it was again. Responsibility, the word he used whenever he wanted obedience without resistance. You should come by my office, he said. We'll go over the numbers together. I won't, I said. Silence stretched across the line. Then we'll meet somewhere neutral, he said finally. There's a charity gala this weekend. Boston Harbor Hotel. You'll be there. I frowned. I didn't say that. You're on the guest list, he said smoothly. I made sure of it. I closed my eyes. Why? Because he said this kind of discussion shouldn't happen in kitchens and hallways. It deserves a proper setting. An audience, he meant. I'll think about it, I said. You should, he replied, because if you don't handle this correctly, people will start asking questions. What kind of questions, I asked. About your grandmother, he said. The words landed exactly where he intended them to. She's elderly, he continued. Vulnerable. If anyone suggested she was manipulated into signing documents she didn't understand. You'd accuse me of elder abuse, I finished. I wouldn't accuse, he said lightly. I'd be forced to respond. My grip tightened on the phone. You're threatening me, I said. I'm protecting the family, he corrected. When the call ended, my hands were shaking, but not with fear. With recognition. This was the same pattern, the same escalation. Control cloaked in concern, pressure framed as protection. I didn't call a lawyer. I called my husband. He listened without interrupting as I told him everything, the bank, the numbers, the call. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. He's desperate, Luke said finally. I frowned. You don't know that. I do, he replied. Men like your father don't reach for threats unless they're already bleeding. Luke worked with data for a living, patterns, financial behavior. He saw things other people missed because they weren't looking in the right places. He wouldn't push this hard if he didn't need the money, Luke continued, which means he's hiding something. That night, Luke spread documents across our table. Public records, corporate filings, shell companies stacked inside shell companies like nesting dolls. This isn't an empire, he said quietly. It's a facade. I leaned over his shoulder, scanning the numbers. Loans, transfers, gaps where there shouldn't have been any. He's insolvent, Luke said, and worse, he's being audited. The word hung between us. He needs liquidity, Luke went on. Fast. And your inheritance is clean money, untouched, the kind that could cover his tracks. I thought of the way my father's voice had softened on the phone. The urgency disguised as concern. He wasn't trying to save me. He was trying to save himself. The next morning I called him back. About the gala, I said, letting my voice waver just enough. I've been thinking. Yes, he said too quickly. I don't know what I'm doing, I admitted. The bank started talking about reporting requirements, federal oversight. I'm scared. His breath caught, just slightly. That's exactly why you need me, he said. I can handle this. I know how these systems work. I don't want trouble, I whispered. And you won't have any, he said, if you trust me. Trust. The word tasted bitter. What would we do, I asked. We'd consolidate, he said. Move the assets under the family trust. It's clean, legal, efficient. And the taxes, I asked. I'll make them disappear, he said. I always do. There it was, the confession he didn't realize he was making. When I asked, Saturday, he said. At the gala. We'll sign everything in the VIP suite before the speeches. I'll announce a major expansion. It'll look legitimate. He wanted the spotlight, the validation, the illusion restored. Okay, I said softly, I'll be there. He exhaled, satisfied. You're doing the right thing. When I hung up, Luke looked at me across the table. He took the bait, I said. Luke nodded. Then it's time to build the hook. We didn't forge documents that night. We designed a trap. One that relied on my father's favorite weakness. His certainty that I would never be the threat. The ballroom at the Boston Harbor Hotel glowed like a promise that had never intended to be kept. Crystal chandeliers spilled light onto marble floors. Linen-draped tables hummed with old money and careful laughter. Men in tailored suits leaned close to one another, trading favors disguised as compliments. Women in silk smiled without revealing their teeth. Every inch of the room was designed to say stability, success, control. My father thrived in places like this. I arrived at 7:58 p.m. Not early, not late, precise. I wasn't wearing my uniform. I wasn't wearing anything that announced authority. I wore a simple black dress, structured and restrained, the kind of elegance that didn't beg to be noticed. The only thing different about me was the way I walked, straight through the room, not around it. I saw him immediately. He stood near the stage, laughing too loudly, one hand on the shoulder of a local councilman, the other, gesturing broadly as he spoke. His confidence radiated outward, a force field that pulled attention toward him. This was his element, the place where he believed nothing could touch him. When his eyes landed on me, his smile sharpened. He excused himself and crossed the room, greeting donors along the way like a king making rounds. When he reached me, he leaned in, his voice low and practiced. "You're late," he said. "Do you have it?" I nodded and handed him the folder. Blue leather, clean edges, the kind of presentation that calmed men like him. His fingers closed around it with visible relief. "Good," he said. "We'll go upstairs." The VIP suite overlooked the harbor glass walls, framing the dark water like a painting. A single desk stood near the window, documents laid out neatly, pens aligned with deliberate care. Luke had done his homework. My father didn't sit. He didn't read. He skimmed headings the way men do when they're already convinced of the outcome. "This puts the assets under the family trust," he said, flipping pages. "Power of attorney, sole trustee authority. Yes, this is clean." "Do I need to sign anything?" I asked, keeping my voice small. "No," he said, waving a hand. "Just me. You're transferring responsibility." Responsibility, again. He picked up the pen. A smarter man might have noticed the title Affidavit of Historical Financial Management and Sole Liability. A careful man might have questioned why the dates stretched back 20 years. A cautious man would have wondered why the appendix listed entities he barely remembered. My father was none of those things. He signed. The pen scratched across the paper, bold and confident. His name looked the same as it always had, large, certain, unquestioned. "There," he said, handing the folder back to me. "It's done." He straightened his jacket and glanced at his watch. "I need to get to the stage. Big announcement." He didn't wait for my response. I stepped aside as he left the suite, the folder warm in my hands. My heart wasn't racing. My breath was steady. This was the calm that comes after months of preparation, when action finally replaces anticipation. I pulled out my phone, took a single photograph of the signature page, and pressed send. 3 miles away, Luke received it. Within seconds, the affidavit was attached to a whistleblower complaint, already loaded into a federal portal. Every entity, every date, every signature my father had just claimed as his own. Downstairs, the lights dimmed. My father took the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, spreading his arms wide. "Tonight I'm proud to announce a historic expansion of the Hale Family Foundation." Applause rolled through the room. A commitment of $12 million, he continued, to the future of this city. He smiled as he said it, the smile of a man unveiling his legacy. Behind him, the massive LED screen flickered. The foundation logo vanished. In its place appeared a seal, bold, unmistakable. Department of Justice, Federal Asset Seizure in Progress. The applause collapsed into silence. My father turned confused rather than afraid. He looked back at the screen, then out at the room as if waiting for someone to laugh. No one did. The doors at the back of the ballroom burst open. 6 agents moved with practiced efficiency, their presence cutting through the room like a blade. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses froze halfway to lips. "Richard Hale," the lead agent called. "Step away from the podium." My father's face drained of color. "Do you know who I am?" he demanded. "Yes," the agent replied calmly. "You're the sole trustee who just accepted legal responsibility for 20 years of unreported financial activity." My father's gaze snapped to me. "She tricked me," he shouted. "My daughter, she manipulated me." "Save it for the grand jury," the agent said. Handcuffs clicked shut. Cameras flashed as he was led away, his tailored jacket wrinkling under the pressure of hands that didn't care about appearances. The man who had ruled rooms with his voice was reduced to silence in seconds. I thought it was over. It wasn't. The VIP suite door slammed behind me. I turned to see my brother standing there, sweat darkening his collar, his eyes wild. You ruined everything, he hissed. It was already ruined, I said evenly. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a steak knife, the serrated edge catching the light. There was no calculation left in him now, only panic. Luke stepped between us. Put it down, he said. My brother lunged. Luke moved faster. The knife clattered across marble. My brother cried out as his wrist twisted at an angle it was never meant to reach. He sank to the floor, sobbing not from pain, but from the sudden realization that he was nothing without my father's shadow. Agents arrived seconds later. When the room was finally empty, I stood alone by the window looking out at the harbor. The water moved the way it always had, indifferent to human collapse. My father had believed power was loud. He had been wrong. It was patient. And tonight it had spoken. 3 weeks later, the harbor smelled like salt and rain. Morning light slid across the water in thin, patient lines, the kind that didn't rush to impress anyone. I sat on the small balcony of my apartment with a mug of coffee cooling between my hands, watching a tugboat ease past the docks. The city was waking up, unaware that one of its loudest men had gone quiet. My father was still in custody. Bail had been denied. The judge cited flight risk, financial complexity, and the kind of arrogance that mistakes money for immunity. His assets were frozen, accounts sealed, properties locked down behind legal language so dense it felt like concrete. The empire he'd bragged about at dinner parties had collapsed into a stack of filings and case numbers. My brother had taken a plea. No inheritance, no grand speeches, just probation, mandatory counseling, and a job he'd never wanted, entry-level, clock-in, clock-out. The kind of work that didn't care who his father had been. My grandmother slept better now. She called every morning sometimes just to tell me what she was making for lunch, sometimes to ask if the news said anything new. I could hear the relief in her voice layered beneath the worry she'd carried for years. "They can't hurt you anymore," she said once. I didn't correct her, because what she meant was that they couldn't erase me anymore. The trust transfer finalized quietly. No ceremony, no announcements, just signatures and confirmations, and the soft click of systems doing what they were designed to do when no one interfered. Luke asked me what I wanted to do with it. The money. I looked at the ocean on my screen, savor the same one I'd stared at during sleepless nights overseas. Nothing, I said. He smiled, not surprised, nothing. "Let it grow," I said. "I'm still serving. I still have work to do." And it was true. I reported back to base the following Monday. Same boots, same routine, same early mornings and long days. No one saluted differently. No one treated me like someone who had crossed into another class of life. That mattered to me more than I expected. Money didn't give me power. It gave me insulation. The kind that lets you say no without fear. The kind that keeps threats from landing. The kind that allows silence to be a choice, not a survival tactic. I burned the last copy of the affidavit on the balcony that afternoon. The paper curled in blackened ash, lifting into the air before dissolving completely. I didn't need it anymore. The system had already done its work. That document was just a record of something I'd carried for too long, the belief that I was small because I'd been quiet. Luke sat beside me, his shoulder warm against mine. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. "I am." And I meant it. Because what my father never understood was this strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't shout into microphones or demand rooms fall silent. It waits, it learns, it endures. It shows up when the time is right. I stayed in touch with the bank, with the attorneys, with the administrators who spoke in measured tones and never once assumed they knew what was best for me. They asked, they listened, they respected boundaries. It felt like stepping into a different language. The wedding photos arrived in the mail a month later. I flipped through them slowly, stopping at the image of my grandmother pressing the passbook into my hands. The moment before everything changed. The moment before the noise. I framed that one. Not because of what came after, but because of what it represented. Trust, quiet foresight, love that didn't need applause. I don't attend galas anymore. I don't sit at tables where respect is conditional and power is borrowed. I choose smaller rooms now. Honest ones. Places where silence isn't a weapon and voices don't have to fight to be heard. Family, I learned, isn't blood. It's who stands with you when the vault opens. It's who believes you even when the room laughs. It's who protects you without asking for control in return. If you're listening to this story and something inside you feels familiar, if you've ever been dismissed, spoken over, or told that your worth depended on how loudly you performed, I want you to know this. You don't need to shout to matter. You don't need permission to be powerful. And you don't need to prove yourself to people who decided you were invisible. Sometimes the quiet ones are the most prepared. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear from you. What part stayed with you the longest? Where are you listening from? Leave a comment below and share your story. And if you want to keep walking this road with us through stories of truth, resilience, and quiet justice, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. We're telling these stories together.